So that's okay. Now, so a very good afternoon to everybody. So I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So my name is Peter Lee. I'm the director of the ARC, the Center for Medical Implant Technologies, CIMIT for short. So today we are really very privileged to have Professor Jason Chuen to help launch our lecture series on technology from a clinical perspective. So we'll be running this series throughout the whole 4-year period where the ARC Center is running. So hopefully, one every 2 months. Now, so a little bit of background. So I'm an engineer, and my experience working with clinicians and surgeons often makes me think that we are sort of from a different planet, right? So, but we all know that, some of the most innovative and brilliant technology ideas sort of, they all come from clinicians. So I mean, if you walk into an operating theater today, you can see the fruits of this collaboration between engineers and doctors. Now, so Associate Professor Jason Chuen, he's the Director of the Vascular Surgery at Austin Health. He holds a specialist qualification in vascular surgery and a Master of Public Health, and was the Murray F. Brennan Visiting Scholar, courtesy of the American College of Surgeons in 2018. He's also the founding director of the 3D Med Lab, a 3D printing laboratory at Austin Health. Now, he's a bit of a techie himself. He's a database programmer and a computer network consultant before starting med school. So that's quite interesting. So he has maintained his interest in technology. And I think we are really privileged and happy to have Jason doing this first lecture. So Jason, I'll pass the time to you then.
Thanks, Peter. I'll rely on you to let me know if I'm running to time. Now, it's a real pleasure being asked to give this talk. I know this is something we'd talked about and planned for a little while to expand the thought process and the shared experience amongst our team in the ARC CIMIT and in the University of Melbourne Biomedical Engineering Division. So I thought that I would start with a bit of a generic talk about how we look at new technologies and the risks that they pose in implementing and how we deal with that. And whilst I've got a fair number of slides, I might skip through some of them. And I'd also invite our other panelists to interrupt me wherever they feel it's necessary to expand on anything that they think is particularly relevant or interesting. So I know that Peter, David, Jay, you usually have no hesitation interrupting me anyway. So I'm sure that you'll interrupt me where necessary. So I'll bring up these slides, and hopefully the miracles of PowerPoint and Zoom will cooperate. The gods are sometimes in our favor, and I think they hopefully are today. So as I said, or as Peter said, I'm the Director of Vascular Surgery at the Austin Hospital, which is aligned with the University of Melbourne, and we also run a dedicated 3D medical printing laboratory. This is the only multidisciplinary 3D medical printing laboratory in Melbourne and in fact Australia when we first started, but I'm pleased to say that we've had more and more partners come on board with the same kind of vision. So just to begin with, technological change is something that we all deal with. It's a constant in the evolution of human society. We always find ways to make things smaller or bigger, or to do chores faster, better, to bring things closer together whilst being remote at the same time. But unfortunately, sometimes when we create all of these processes and devices, we can get a little bit blinded by what we've created rather than fully appreciating the implications of what we've done. And this is especially true in this modern age where we spend so much time talking about disruptive technology. And I think that disruptive technology, whilst it's a popular term, we often sort of forget what it really means, and it's a fundamental change in the way that we do things. It's sort of like taking all the cards in the deck and throwing them in the air and then seeing what you can make of it afterwards, or completely shuffling the deck. Now, we traditionally in academia and science have built on top of things. So we've taken a piece of technology or a method or a piece of knowledge, and we've built gradually layer by layer on top of that to achieve something greater or something bigger. But increasingly what we're finding in this sort of modern world is that we are taking things that we thought we could take for granted and then changing our assumptions about them. Or we're looking for the gaps between technologies, so between pieces of knowledge, and then finding ways to work within those gaps or within those interfaces, or to link different silos of knowledge together. And you'll recognize a lot of these themes that that I've listed here, but I'll explain them a little bit more. But just keep in mind one thing, which is that no matter what we bring in, there's always going to be ways for it to go wrong. So I very much like this saying that nothing can ever be foolproof because fools are so ingenious. They will always find a way to mess up your carefully laid plans, whether that be a piece of computer programming or a government hotel quarantine mechanism. One of the major pieces of technology that we are all familiar with now is information technology, which is this shift in the knowledge base. So traditionally, all of the information that I would have learnt in medicine or in medical school would come in a couple of textbooks. And then when I expanded beyond that, I could find pretty much everything in our medical library. Now we have more information in our smartphones than you could find in a library. And it's like the shift from the amount of content in Encyclopedia Britannica to Wikipedia. It is no longer possible for one person to memorize and to remember all of this information. And so our skill set has shifted from knowing everything to knowing how to find what we know. And this is a fundamental change in what we teach in medicine and what we teach in all disciplines, is that the ability to source the information accurately and correctly in a timely manner is more important than knowing it straight away. And furthermore, being able to take that source of information and then to validate it or to verify it. So the internet and all of these devices have become sort of an external brain to us. The other theme that we see in medicine is a shift in the power balance. So traditionally the doctor knew everything, and the patient was the person who was told what they needed to know. And increasingly we are engaging patients in their care. We have taken it as a fundamental that patients should be making informed decisions about their care, and in order to do that, they need to have the information to do that. Increasingly, patients have the ability to go out and find that information for themselves. So it's not uncommon for patients to come to an appointment with me and then to bring a stack of papers and then expect me to have read it all before they got here. The other thing is that the way that we communicate, and this is especially true in this sort of non-contact space, is the way that we communicate with each other and with patients has changed dramatically. Now, traditionally, if as a doctor I sought a piece of information or a piece of advice from another specialist, I'd have to see a patient, I'd have to write a letter, I would have to send that letter in the mail to someone else, and then they would read it. They may or may not see the patient themselves, and then they would send me back a letter telling me what they thought. And that's as true today as it was in the 1800s or 1700s. However, with electronic communication, the instantaneousness of that communication has managed to shrink the time frames down. We have more or less abolished the tyranny of distance. And so we have the ability to access opinions and specialists and expertise immediately that we never used to. There's a question in the audience about how do you know that the information we source is accurate? Well, that's really the hardest part of what we're trying to teach now, is that there is so much information out there that it has to fit within a paradigm of knowledge. There has to be some verifiable source to it, and you should be able to trace it back to some source data and to recreate the logical decision making to reach those conclusions. So yes, just as you shouldn't trust everything that's in Wikipedia, however, you should at the very least be able to go through the sources on that Wikipedia page and verify whether they're correct or not. The other thing that comes with all of that knowledge and information and the telecommunications, meaning that we can access a lot of resources, and we in fact have a market. We've got a glut of resources, medical resources to choose from, is that traditionally it was a very personal relationship between a doctor and a patient. But increasingly the amount of variety means that we have to codify things. So we have to find a way to classify things. We group procedures together so that if you're getting a colonoscopy in London or in Mumbai or in Melbourne or in Bangkok, that you're getting the same procedure to the same standards for the same reason, for the same result, and one would hope for the same fee, but that's certainly not true. But what it does is it sort of puts medical care into these generic buckets rather than the nature of the personalised communication that we used to have. But the effect of all of that globalisation means, all of that commodification means that you can globalise services. Now this is perhaps a diagram for another age. So with COVID and with our current limitations on global travel, then this might not be so true for medical services, certainly ones that are delivered physically, because you can no longer think about flying to the US for your heart surgery or flying to India for your heart surgery if you were to get the same standard but cheaper. But there's certainly no reason now why you couldn't have a psychiatrist that you see who's based in London or who's based in South Africa or Cape Town or in Denver, Colorado. So there are some services that are even now still globalized, whereas there are others that are limited by this current lack of global travel. With all of those changes, we see that the way that we conduct medicine has changed dramatically. And one of those examples is in radiology. Traditionally in radiology, there was one person in the hospital who understood x-rays, and they would look at every form of x-ray. They would usually sit in the basement and in this dark room with lights and films, and if you had a question about what was wrong with the patient, you would go down and see this specialist doctor and have a discussion about what type of x-ray would be the most appropriate, and once it was done, what those x-rays meant, and how they were interpreted in the context of the clinical case that you were seeing. And the radiologist was usually a very highly clinically trained physician who then went on to do radiology as an interest. Now things have changed somewhat, and the amount of information you have to absorb and produce as a radiologist is so much greater that you don't have time to go through an entire physician specialty training and then do radiology. And radiology has also changed from physical film to electronic, so that these electronic images can be transferred all the way around the world. And that means that the radiologist can essentially work in this black box where they're fed a queue of images to look at, and they produce a report that goes to a doctor that they might never ever meet on a patient that they have no exposure to other than these pictures. And that gives rise to the possibility of turning radiology into a business rather than a very personalized medical service. And you'll see this type of thing happening all over the place. And even now that we've got this growth in telehealth, there is the ability to create businesses where the doctor sits in their office or their home, and then they just churn through 20 or 30 or 40 patients in the space of a morning, where they never do anything more than talk to them or look at them on a screen. And that changes the dynamics. It changes the relationship you have with a patient, and it also opens up room for manipulation of medicine from a personal care service into a commercial service. So one of the real risks with modern technology is turning the art and science and the relationship of medicine into a purely business arrangement. And you will see this increasingly commonly as medicine becomes commodified. Now, I did mention before that we have a 3D printing laboratory at the Austin, but one of the things that we do, and which, if you're familiar with the engineering side of things, is we take a whole bunch of different technologies in order to create these anatomical models. And it's great to be able to make these models and to be able to show them off, but they have to fit within a context of something that's clinically useful. And so you can't just take a technology and roll it out and then suddenly expect that to have transformed medical care, because the amount of support services behind this is huge. You have to have integrated imaging facilities. You need to have people who can handle the software packages, who understand anatomy and modeling, who can operate the printers, who understand materials science. And you also need a clinical framework around this about how are you going to make this useful, how do you ensure that doctors understand what it is that you're delivering to them. And so when you take this technology that seems really simple and you roll it out, you have to think about the whole framework and the sustainable workforce that has to come with this. And that's one of the key things that we do in our 3D medical printing laboratory, is we look very carefully at how do we build the front end and the back end of these systems, so that instead of just dumping 3D models or 3D printed objects on people, how can we make sure that it is something that's sustainable, something that integrates well into our medical workforce and medical systems, and something that adds real value. And that's another problem that you will see, is that people will come up with really great ideas, but then they won't understand the medical side of that technology and how it integrates into a system of care. The other types of issues we see, and this is just a whirlwind tour of some of the computer-aided technologies we have. Over time, we've changed from looking at CT scans in this sort of multi-slice format to 3D reconstructions and quite complicated centerline analyses, to shifts in how we view and how we process imaging, and taking that information and turning it into something that you can walk through in virtual reality. And this is this image on the left is from my colleague Lawrence Lau, who's currently in Toronto and working with one of our sister organisations. And during my trip to New York some time ago, I discovered that no matter how you slice or dice this, you really still look like an idiot wearing VR headsets. But we can take this virtual information, this computer-aided information, and we can bring it into an operating theatre environment where it's less intrusive. We can do all sorts of things with overlaid headsets, Google Glass, the Microsoft headsets, but some of the really simple things that are really effective is taking a 3D model and overlaying it onto a plain X-ray, so that in this case we can use it to guide how we deliver stents and treat aneurysms. And this type of technology is now becoming the mainstay of next generation X-ray suites that are being installed into hospitals. So this is the Amigo suite at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and this bottom picture is the Yuanlin Hospital in Taiwan, where they integrate within an operating theatre all of the imaging modalities that you could have, from a CT scanner to an MRI scanner to an angiography X-ray machine, to a 3D localization facility for brain surgery, so that you can have a patient on the operating table, you can have these imaging modalities that scan everything, and then it can then guide you in 3D to the very spot that you want to get to on the CT scan or the X-ray. Now, these are the types of technology that we're introducing into operating theatres today, and this is a typical Da Vinci robot, which we insert ports within a patient and then we operate through that. And one of the works that we've been doing is trying to integrate our 3D modelling into the imaging systems of these computers and robots. And not only do these robots do things for us, but this is a computerized angiography robot that allows you to sit away from the X-ray source so that you can conduct an angiogram or a minimally invasive procedure without getting as much x-rays. But this thing also records what you do. So it takes all of the information, all of your hand movements, all of your manipulations, and then puts it all into a database. And this company hopes that by collecting all that data and feeding it into an AI system, that they can then recreate how a specialist doctor performs an operation, so that a computer can actually do that. And we can certainly do some amazing things with robotics and with computers. Some of you might be familiar with this, but there's no question in my mind that if you can get a robot to do parkour, then you could probably get a robot to do an operation. The other part of this sort of substitution, so to speak, is that not only are we looking at taking robots to replace surgeons and doctors, but you can task substitute with almost anything. So if you can break down a medical task into something that another person or another machine, or in this case a pigeon, can perform, then you can replace a doctor. And if you can identify enough components that can be replaced, then you really change the role of a doctor from someone who is doing these types of repetitive, menial, specialized tasks to someone who hopefully is involved in some higher order function. But together with that, doctors take a lot of pride in our technical skills, and there is a real risk that doctors will lose our professional identity, our concept of who we are and what we do. And sometimes that can be a real threat to the medical profession. The introduction of nursing and the introduction of allied health, none of those were straightforward, simple things to implement. It wasn't as if Florence Nightingale woke up one day and said, I'm just going to do this and then everyone's going to be okay with it. The creation of a nursing profession to change the role and the working of doctors was not one that came easily. And the introduction of these types of changes in working environments and working mechanisms can be a real threat to the medical profession, and not just to doctors, but to anyone who's involved in a specialised health service, because their role and their job and their title and their identity is a threat. But at the end of the day, we all work within a systems framework, and there is a lot of discussion about how artificial intelligence and machine learning can replace medical decision making and medical tasks. The fact is that this is not new, and there are plenty of professions where specialized tasks have been replaced. So if you sit in a modern airplane cockpit, even though all of these buttons are ones that pilots can push and pull on and press and turn and dial, there are computer systems that run almost every part of this airplane, so that the pilot is there to oversee and to override where necessary, but by and large these planes run on autopilot. And that is in essence what we're doing when we protocolize or systematize medical care, when we create systems of care and we create redundancies and we create error checklists. All of those things are there to standardize the way that medical care is given, and also to reduce the cognitive burden that exists on a health professional. But in the task of doing that, what you're taking away is some of the active cognitive function that doctors and specialists bring to the party. And when you become part of a cog in a large mechanism, then you stop thinking about the mechanism that you are in. It's very easy if your job is just to turn up, sign a few forms, push a few buttons, and to approve things done by other people or other systems, to stop thinking about the consequences of your actions. And that can be a source of error and risk in itself. And a really tragic example of this is a patient who was in a hospital that had every form of medical technology you'd possibly have. It had a electronic medical record system. It had an electronic prescribing system that would detect when people had side effects due to multiple medications. Any prescriptions were ordered electronically and then sent to a robotic pharmacy that would pluck out the medicine into packets, and then it would print out instructions, and a robot would deliver that to the room of the patient, and then a nurse would come around several times a day and then pick up that order, read the instructions, and then give the patient the medication. Now, the problem was in this particular case that due to a calculation error, a pediatric patient was prescribed 38 times their normal dose of antibiotics. And this happened despite a lot of checks and balances that should have stopped it. In this case, a doctor who was tired and who spent each day approving 25 or sometimes hundreds of alerts and warnings on a computer system, didn't notice when one of those alerts said that they had overprescribed a dose of antibiotics. And when that was sent through to the pharmacy, the computer system didn't have a catch to say that this was abnormal. And then even when 38 tablets rocked up in the box next to the patient's room and the nurse picked it up, she looked at the order and thought, this is a bit odd, but I'm here to do my job, so I'm just going to give this patient 38 tablets. And this is one of the risks that happens when people don't see the bigger picture, they don't see the consequences of their actions, or they are overloaded with small repetitive tasks that and with warnings and dialogues that they develop alert fatigue, and compound that with people who are tired, who are underpaid and overworked, and they don't feel that their job is meaningful, then it's very easy for those kind of errors to happen. And when you look at how these things happen, it's rarely because of one person who did the wrong thing. It's almost always because there are lots of things that are happening and there are checks at each stage, but they just didn't check for the thing that you thought that you weren't looking for. And what we're increasingly finding is that medicine and medical care is not so much a single pathway where you can just create a hard stop at each point. But medical care is delivered by lots of people doing many different things at once, and the interactions of people between each other and patients, and different systems. And so you cannot necessarily predict what the consequence of changing one piece of that system is going to be. And this is something that we really haven't been prepared for until recently. In addition, we now are so reliant on electronic communication, and especially now with this massive growth in online and cloud-based technology. You all know about the sort of WannaCry ransomware attacks that went around the world not long ago. You've read about hacks into the NHS and the Australian Parliament and the UK Parliament. And the same happens in healthcare as well. In one sense, cybersecurity risks are something that we understand, but one of the things that we often fail to understand is the importance of information protection and patient privacy. And in a world where the delivery of complex, timely, multi-discipline medical care requires us to share information very widely and regularly within our colleagues and within medical networks. Sometimes we don't understand, or we forget the consequences of sharing that information. And in this particular example, what happened was that the University of Chicago Hospital, the medical center, engaged in a project with Google to place some of their patients' health information and records onto Google's medical record platform. And whilst the medical center, if they were working as a hospital alone, would not necessarily have approved this, because they were owned by the university and the university felt that this was a research activity, then the research side thought that they could do this without any major risk. But the problem was that even though the information was de-identified when it was uploaded, it could be pieced back together to identify patients. And this is not just unique to the US or to this particular case. There was a large set of data that was released by the Australian Department of Health of de-identified patient information and activity. And there has been work already that has demonstrated that if you take enough of this data, that you can identify the characteristics and behavior and identity of a particular person. Admittedly, that's out of hundreds and millions of people that you might be able to identify a handful of them, but even that alone is concerning, that the consequences of that information disclosure is unappreciated. And this brings us to this concern that whilst we can sit around and dream up the things that go wrong, you can't anticipate all of the things that could possibly go wrong. And if you think back to that quote I put up at the start, that nothing can be foolproof because fools are so ingenious, you can't know the things that you don't know. And we are seeing this and learning this again and again. It's one of these lessons that you never really learn enough times. When we introduced this new method of treating aortic aneurysm, so this swelling here is in the blood vessel is what we call an aneurysm, and this new technology was placing a stent inside as opposed to cutting it out and replacing it. What we realized was that there were a whole host of new problems with this technology that we hadn't anticipated, or we'd anticipated some of them, but not all of them. So we didn't really anticipate that people would have difficulty identifying when this operation was failing. We didn't really know all of the possible ways that this operation could go wrong and how you might need to recover from it. We didn't know what complications would happen 10 or 20 or 30 years down the track. And we also didn't anticipate that people would be taking these grafts and then putting them in upside down or backwards or twisted or in locations where they weren't designed to go. You can't beat human ingenuity for breaking rules. Because that's what humans do, and that's what doctors do, is that they take every tool that is available to them and they find a way to use it, hopefully to benefit patients, but sometimes it can result in things that they can't anticipate. And this really came home, if you recall a few years ago, there was an international consortium of journalists that investigated the medical regulation system and identified some concerns in the way that new devices were being introduced. And a major example of this was the introduction of pelvic mesh. Now, mesh itself is not a novel technology. It's been around for decades, but the application of it to treat patients with vaginal or pelvic prolapse was new. And this was a technique that was essentially dreamt up one day by a gynecologist who thought that it might work and tried it and thought it seemed to give reasonable results. And only afterwards, in fact, a long time afterwards, did all the complications that arise from this become evident. So we are seeing this problem all the time. Every time we design or create a new procedure or a new device or a new implant, we have to think about how things can go wrong. I mean, it's great to think that we can 3D print these implants and replace the delivery of these prostheses and change the way and dare I say disrupt the way that medical implants are introduced. But we have to think about how do we regulate this so that it is introduced in a safe manner. The way that we traditionally assessed the effectiveness of new technology or new medical techniques is to do what's called a randomized controlled trial. But it's pretty clear that there are some things that are just obvious and you don't need to do randomized controlled trials on. And there's also things where no matter what type of randomized controlled trial you do, the practical limitations of only having a limited group, a small sample size, and a limited time frame to assess complications means that you're not going to pick everything up. So the way that we conduct medical regulation in Australia is through the TGA and through the Australian Therapeutic Register of Therapeutic Goods. It's based on the potential risk of the new technology versus the benefit that is being offered. And this is especially coming true in this setting of a coronavirus vaccine, where the potential benefit is very high, the risk is unknown, and the need though is extreme. So the TGA will go through all these processes in determining risk and how extensively something should be assessed. So for example, the degree of the number of ways that a face shield can fail is very limited. The number of ways that a face mask can fail is greater, and sometimes you might not appreciate how they can fail. When we're designing these things though, we have to look at how can we build safety and avoid risk in the design of new products and new technologies. How can you change the hardware, the way that this thing is presented, the way that it's constructed in order to prevent failure modes? And how can you change the software and I'm not talking computer software here necessarily, but the human-facing side of a technology in order to ensure that errors don't occur. Traditionally, we have done bench testing and we've done animal testing. We then take devices or medicines and we assess them for safety and effectiveness. And then we do what are called phase 3 studies, a large scale safety and efficacy testing before something goes on to market. But this last part, phase 4 studies or post-market surveillance, is absolutely critical, and it's the one that we overlook all the time. We let things go to market and then we forget about them. We don't necessarily check in all the time and collate and collect all of the failures that happen in order to re-engineer and redesign that product to make it better or safer. And this will be particularly true in the field of 3D printed or 3D manufactured implants and devices, especially when there are questions over who is responsible for it. Just to bring things home, just remember that we talk about risk and regulation and safety in an abstract sense, but it really comes home when you're dealing with patients who are very, very vulnerable. They're put in a position where they cannot defend themselves. They can't protect themselves, and it's up to us to protect them from our mistakes. It is incumbent upon us as the people who conceive of this new technology to think very hard and long about how do we make sure that that technology does what we think it does and is as safe as we can possibly make it. So I will stop there. And just a reminder that ARC CMIT is all about bringing people of different disciplines together, and there really should be no shame in us hanging out.
Thank you very much, Jason. We have about 10 minutes for question and answer. So if you like to pose a question, you can click on the Q&A button, and then the panelists will participate. And of course we will also get Jason to answer those questions. So just very quickly, I just introduced the panelists, myself, and then David Ackland. He's the Deputy Director of the ARC CMIT, and also Jiayi Li. She's the Center Manager for ARC CMIT, and also the Enterprise Fellow for the MedTech in the Melbourne School of Engineering. Right. So please go ahead and pose your questions. I have one that says that about medical tourism. Yeah, I think, Jason, you mentioned about medical tourism and how globalization is bringing people across country to seek medical care. So what are the strategies that can help manage this type of risk
Look, medical tourism is really, really difficult. And Andrea asks a good question. There are no strategies in a regulatory sense that manages these risks across borders. Once you leave a jurisdiction, you are subject to the regulation of that jurisdiction that you're arriving in. So, I mean, an example is when people go to Thailand for their cosmetic surgery, whether that be breast implants or jaw surgery or buttock implants or whatever. In Australia, there are regulations around how medical care is delivered for people who are registered in Australia. For doctors who are registered in Australia. There is also some regulations around businesses that offer medical services. But the service that's provided in Thailand is purely up to the regulatory authorities in Thailand. If something goes wrong whilst you're there, then whatever insurance or indemnity you might have, or which the doctor over there might have, is what protects you. As soon as you come back, there is no specific obligation for Australian healthcare systems to patch up the mistakes or problems that arose overseas, other than providing basic necessary medical care. So if you have a breast implant in Thailand and it gets infected and you come back to Australia, then the Australian healthcare system will do whatever is necessary to make you safe. And that involves removing the transplants, the implants, giving you antibiotics, healing your wounds, but there is no responsibility to put in new implants or to fix up the cosmetic defect that is there as a result. And that's something that falls within regulatory gaps.
Yeah, there was another question here, and this draws on your comments earlier about the information, not about perhaps about how much we know, but about how we access large amounts of information. And I guess as a clinician, how do you ensure the quality of that information and ensure that it's accurate?
Look, there's a huge amount of information, and what we are increasingly finding is that the specialist bodies, the groups of specialists who sort of self-regulating themselves in these areas, come together to review all of the data and literature and create guidelines. So what we're increasingly seeing, for example, is that there are global guidelines based on peer review of medical data on how to treat certain conditions. Now, the problem with that is that it sort of unifies medical treatment and doesn't allow so much for outliers or variances in opinion or practice or unique cases. That still has to be part of medical decision making. But the other thing that we do is that we work very, very hard to teach our students about assessing and reviewing research data and trying to work out how valid it is and reliable it is. So that information assessment is a key part of medical training now.
Well, we have a question around robots. So Hussein asked, do you think we'll have surgeons soon to work from home with robots? Yeah, should we also train more bioengineers than medical experts? So yeah, it's an interesting question, but I guess it's also when you were talking about the risks, one of the risks that sort of caught my attention was really the loss of professional identity and role. I think with many of us, it's not just the medical profession. Many other professions, like even teaching, can be replaced, right, by Wikipedia. So as a teacher, so you're always constantly you're being challenged by what is out there. Yeah. So maybe in your own personal capacity or opinion, do you think you will be replaced?
Well, look, I think that certainly there is change, but I mean, I think that question came from Hussein. I think he's got a little bit of vested interest in there, but the robotic technology is here. You can't say go away. It's here, and we are constantly looking at how we can leverage it to best use. And the analogy that I might bring to you is the modern musician is now completely reliant. Well, no, I won't say completely reliant, but you look at Ed Sheeran. Half of his show is him using synthesizers and loops and sampling. And he's amazing. He's an amazing performer. But the style of music that he delivers is very different to what you might expect a musician to deliver 100 years ago, when everything was manual. Now, does that mean that he's less of a musician? Does it mean that his music is not as good? No, but the way that someone works in their field, when there are tools that allow them to expand the borders of what they do, the boundaries of what they do, then those are huge opportunities. But yes, they do change the way that you perceive your task. So there are lots of rooms to expand, as long as we don't forget our roots of where we came from and how we came to have the roles that we have, then I think that there's a lot to be gained from those technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a question about, on the similar vein. Yeah, I think one of the interesting point is what kind of education can we give to our fellow clinicians? Yeah, so I think that yeah, what do you think, Jason?
Look, I think that in many senses, the horse has already bolted on this. So many years ago, the doctor was the be-all and end-all of medical care. What the doctor said goes. And you walk into a modern hospital now, and the doctor is merely one member of a large team of people and systems of care that end up with a patient's treatment. And I think that what we're seeing is that the more technological that care system becomes, and the more reliant we are on engineering approaches, then an engineer becomes part of that healthcare team. So yes, I speak from the aspect of a clinician who still holds a fairly important and respected role in medical care, but that role is no longer the sole domain of the doctor. It is something that has to be delivered through a team of people.
Right. Thank you. I apologize, we will not be able to answer all the questions that's been posted because we have hit the 4 p.m. mark. And really, thank you very much, Jason, for for excellent discussion. And we certainly look forward to this series. And we hope that you will come back and join us again. So yeah, thank you again. I can hear all the claps now. Thanks, Jason. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.